very much, Bruce. Bruce Barbecue came all the way up from Ashland to be with us tonight, so thanks again, Bruce. Okay, so up next is Jennifer Chambers. Jennifer Chambers, I first met Jennifer when I was doing the first Eugene Public Library Poetry Showcase in 2012. And she was a supporter representing Groundwaters magazine and one of the contributing poets to read at the event. Later that year, she joined our selection panel for the Eugene 150th birthday celebration poetry collection. She contributed to the collection and helped organize the book launch event as part of Eugene's sesquicentennial celebration last year. So we had a lot of fun doing that. Jennifer Chambers is an award-winning author who writes from the kitchen table of a full house outside of Eugene, Oregon. She has written horror, poetry, adult fiction, women's fiction, and young adult novels. She writes a weekly newspaper column and is a contributing editor for Groundwaters magazine. Her work has been in national newspapers, magazines, television, and radio. Recently, her passion is organic cooking. Her new novel, Brambleberry Farm, is the first book in the Brambleberry Farms series that combines sustainable agriculture with the food-to-table movement prevalent in the Northwest. Find out more about her at jenniferbchambers.com. Please welcome Jennifer Chambers.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. As Stephen said, I'm one of the editors of Groundwaters, which is over there. We've been around for 10 years now. We're a local nonprofit literary quarterly, and our goal is to help local people be published. We really try to be a very kind and gentle sort of magazine. And so the first piece I'm going to read was published in Groundwaters. It was the piece that I won an award for in the South Coast Writers Conference. It's called The Darkness Beyond the Hill. And I'm reading this because it's interesting. It was sort of, as a writer, and as many of you writers know, you kind of go through an evolution if you're writing a long piece with your characters. This was a piece that I wrote that seemed like it was very fully formed. She shows up, the character in this is in my latest book, but in a different form. So later on I'll read from that book and you see how it's different. The Darkness Beyond the Hill. Thunder was crashing, the rain was pelting down, the lights went out, and then Jo found herself alone. The cows, sensibly, crept to a group in the side of the pasture and sought shelter underneath the trees. She could hardly blame them. She was done crying anyway, and who cries their hearts out to calves? In disgust, she shook her head at herself, and in the process sloshed water off her hood and into her ear. Some Valentine's Day this was. Ah, she gasped. It took a minute to use the end of her knitted scarf to wipe out the worst of it. By that time, she got rain down her neck too. Resigned, Jo retied the scarf, tucked the ends in, and zipped up her father's jacket as far as it would go. With the fluorescent security light on its tall pole burning out, it was hard to see in the sideways rain. She took comfort in knowing that she wasn't alone, really. Her boyfriend Alan had stayed in town to give her some space, but if anyone should come up the half-mile driveway, she would know. The cows would alert her. This was the one place where she felt secure, not at the farmhouse where it had happened, but out here in the field. She was close to them here. The rain slowed to a mist. The storm, and the way it had suddenly, violently ended, were much the same as her crying jag, she thought, wiping her nose with a big blue bandana. With a big shuddering sniff, she thought about the chain of events that had led to her sobbing out here in the middle of nowhere on what had been her parents' farm. Her sister had been born with it, was all Jo could figure. That girl had never been right, was the way some had less charitably put it, in stage whispers, as if she didn't know what they'd always tried to keep from her. It had been obvious to some, but never to her mother and father. Jo felt as if her larcenous emotions had sapped all the strength out of her muscles. It was wet, she was soaked on her bottom half, so why not sit down? She felt a little delirious and empty from all the stress and grief and anger. She was in the middle of a cow field during a rainstorm after all. Tilting her head to the side, she saw the white moon beginning to steal out from behind iron-gray clouds. It was what her parents had always called a fingernail moon. Jo's sister Angie had always replied that it looked like a knife. A cut-off stump remained in the middle of the field. She made her way there, her bean boots sucking mud with each step. The stump wobbled a bit as she sat down. She felt self-conscious now, which was absurd. Here she was, perched on a stump, shrouded in her dad's raincoat that smelled of smoke and wet animals. The rain slowed still more and then stopped. Angie had found others like her in the end. It amazed Joe that there could be anyone else who would share her sister's zeal. Angie's friends were smarter, though. They never got caught. She pushed back the hood and closed her eyes to inhale the fresh, clean scent of the still night. The moon was uncovered now. Its crescent was sharp, well-defined, the mocking smile slash of a cut throat. She set her chin, resolved. It wasn't her fault. Never had been. Her sister's choices had led to the outcome. The indigo feature on her small, sturdy Timex flashed blue in the darkness. 10:47, she said aloud. The sound of her voice surprised her in a ridiculous way. It echoed. 10 o'clock was deep dark here in the Pacific Northwest, this time of year. She supposed that she ought to have been scared out here all alone, but an odd hollowness filled her heart instead. A yellow beam of light bobbed up at the bottom of the driveway. It made its way to her as the cattle lowed in morning. Joe realized belatedly that the cows were hardly likely to do anything other than bellow. She was on her own. For a heartbreaking moment, she thought it was her sister. The figure was the right height, but it couldn't be, could it? The paranoid schizophrenic woman who'd killed their parents and schoolmates at her 15-year high school reunion, who honest to God believed she was an avenger from the devil, was somewhere in the system tonight. Joe didn't know or care whether she was in booking or processing or jail, as long as Joe was safe here on her tree stump. Then her breath caught in fear. Please, let it not be Angie's friends. Without trying to move much, she looked around to see what she could get to defend herself. A short branch lay nearby in a clump of grass. Joe grasped the pitchy end in one hand. Who's there? She brandished the branch like a club. It might be any of the ravenous reporters, or the family members of Angie's victims, or Alan, or former schoolmates being sorry. The onslaught since the final court appearance this afternoon had been brutal. She had finally broken away and run back to her farm, to be alone in her pain. Her voice was rough, tear-edged. Who's there? That's the end of the first part of Joe's story. Now, the second part that I'm going to read is from our latest groundwater poetry book, Ripples on the Water. I write a lot of different kinds of things, and I'm trying to kind of show that tonight. I guess I'm a jack of all trades, but I really have enjoyed writing poetry. It's something that I hadn't gone to school for, but really got into after being an editor for the magazine, and I really enjoy it. So I'm lucky to be counted among some poets in the Groundwaters family. The first poem is called Deliveries. It deals with a time when I was volunteering down at the Eugene Library. I was part of a group with the old Eugene Library way back in the day, where I went down to the deep, dark basement, and we got donated books, and we brought them out in a peach cart all the way down to the downtown mall, and we gave them out to the kids who lived there. It was very important to me, and so I wrote a poem about it. Deliveries. I spent a few years, I don't know, maybe 2, delivering free books to the kids who lived in the downtown Eugene Mall. It made me feel better, I don't know, maybe because in every face I was looking for my brother. Maybe he lived in the downtown Eugene Mall. Once a week, I'd load up, go out and deliver cheap paperbacks to children too young to look so old. Constantly surprised by the taste of those I served. The young girl and the 20-something man with her, I chose not to think about their relationship, even when the straps of her tank top kept slipping down. She liked potboiler romance, a young adult fiction, and he sometimes hovered around the edges while she chose, occasionally selecting a science fiction for him, holding it out, wings of hope in her face unfurling when he took it from her outstretched hand. I gave a lot of books away. It got depressing when they were still there, in the rain. And my brother was still there, I think. I wonder if anyone brings him books. The second poem I'm going to read is called One Teacup. It was in the latest Groundwaters, or the first Groundwaters poetry book as well. There is a small metal teacup on the edge of my table. It teeters, then rights itself. The aftershocks rippling it in the saucer, rings that take longer than I expect to stop. I think of the people in Sandy Hook, the days of questions, the nights of grief. I'm fiercely glad. Guilty it isn't my kids, but it could be. We're all saddened, all guilty and glad it's over. Is society the rest of the tea set on the table? Waiting to right itself? Waiting to be made whole again? Or is all the clattering in our saucers so much noise? Blaming and counter-blaming. Nothing's different. How can we affect real change? Is it too naive to just want to get along? I know it is. But how do I tell my little boy it's okay? How can those teaching not be targets of the diffuse rage? Love is the answer. The radio tells me over my numb thoughts. Talk about naive, I think. And yet there's something to that. So I give a little girl the teacup and straighten the plates, and I pour the pretend tea. The last piece I'm going to read is what turned out to be the real Jo in my latest book, Brambleberry Farm. She doesn't have quite such a violent history, but she's still pretty interesting, I think. I'm going to read the very beginning, and then I'll read a part where Jo talks about who turned out to be her actual sister in the second section. Chapter 1. The inside of the community college cooking school classroom had all the charm of a damp bomb shelter. Time had virtually stopped since the mid-19th century construction. Much the same, the student thought, could be said of its residents. The girl absently patted at her pin-up girl waves and watched the mixed bunch of students in the classroom interact. She'd been nervous for the class, her last, to start. To a person like her, dark buildings generally tasted either like dust in her mouth or like wet hair. Experiencing the color gray was always like that. As a person with synesthesia, a neurological disorder where experiencing one sense can trigger a different sense at the same time, Jo could often taste colors and feel shapes, or occasionally hear the frequency of things she touched. Smells could trigger it too. Sometimes she would be able to control it. Right now, the rectangle screen in front of the room pressed on her psyche like an iron bar. Lord, give me patience, she murmured. Jo had recently started going to a small multi-doctrine community church in order to give her life balance, and it was a stretch for the tattooed and formerly angry 30-year-old, but she was trying. She hoped it counted for the big guy upstairs, and she hoped it made up for the millions of small transgressions she committed. You can never be too safe. Her classmates ranged from octogenarians to crunchy hippies to technology refugees from Seattle. She raised her shoulders to her ears, glad for yoga practice that morning, and breathed quiet and shallow through her mouth to avoid the fast food scent of the hyper-thin whippet of a woman 3 rows over. Josephine Flynn, the accelerated culinary arts program teacher, was a dead ringer for the actor Sam Shepard. It was hard for Jo not to stare at him. She'd always been a sucker for a good mustache. She flipped the pages of her spiral notebook, waiting for him to speak rather than start managing to decode the text. Is Josephine Flynn here? The teacher had started the roll, but she'd been too preoccupied to notice. With a snap, she shut the book on the hot pink board she doodled while waiting. Grapheme synesthesia, where certain numbers or letters were seen as colors, was her most challenging issue, even more so than the tasting of colors thing. She wasn't ready to brave untangling the words yet, she thought. That was why she'd kept out of traditional school for so long, having made it through high school on a lick and a promise, as her mom would have said. Here, she called out. It's Jo, actually. She waved a stubby-nailed hand and pushed back a piece of her hair behind her ear, pleased that it was still shiny from the conditioning treatment after the last color job. She had to keep her hair pinned up for her job as a waiter and mostly a part-time chef at Brambleberry Farms' fledgling organic restaurant. Ergo, her haircut that allowed for some freedom but mostly was under a cap. So that gives you a little taste of the beginning of Jo. And I'll read from my very last piece, where Jo kind of talks about her past. Chapter 10. Jo stared into the dark, hopeful eyes of her mother in the photograph from 10 years ago that sat on her bedside table in a simple silver frame. A painful squeeze filled her heart with a mixture of foreboding and resentment. Her gaze slid over to her sister, hugging her mom joyfully in the photo, frozen in time. Her mother looked so happy and so naive to what would happen with Janet later. It had always been like this, always. Ever since her older sister had left on one of her merry jaunts to pick flowers, or farm plants in a professional grow operation in California, or run off to the desert at Burning Man in the middle of barren Utah, or go find herself at a rainbow gathering in some undisclosed location. Janet would leave, and Jo would stay with her parents and grandparents. Their mother and father would hope, and she would delude herself that it would be different this time. Janet would succeed. As always, Jo would be the receiver of the occasional communication Janet deigned to send from the road, wherever she happened to be. Jo would be left to translate drunken late-night phone calls and conversations where her sister's meaning was garbled, unclear, or maybe drug-addled. Somehow she had to make sense of them and reassure her mother and father that everything was okay. It had been a long time since she had heard from Janet. Her face grew warm thinking about how glad she'd felt about that. Picking up the small card tucked into the corner of the frame, Jo studied the quotation she had written on it a year ago. She had heard the lyrics in a compelling song on the internet radio station she'd listened to while she worked late at night in the campus cafeteria. So sturdy up your heart, for the road is long ahead. I'll be with you, even though we're apart, but your road is yours to tread. She fingered a bent corner of the note card, noting that the floral spray in the corner was faded from purple to muted lavender. To her brain, the word yours in the song, quote, was highlighted as if by pink pen. She had tried to explain to her mom and dad the significance of the word, and that her synesthesia made it the most important part of the phrase, the salient part to Joe. Her choices were the most important thing, no matter what the circumstance a person found themselves in. Janet's life had been Janet's choice. Their parents' decision to light a candle in their hearts for Janet, no matter what the odds, had been their choice as well. Joe had been told not to blame her sister, and mostly, she hadn't. But in some ways, Joe's life had been Janet's choice too. That's the end of my pieces.
Take like a short 5-minute break and grab a glass of wine, some snacks, and then we'll come back. All right?
Thank you.
Coffee.